Hey everybody, welcome back to Great Northwest Weaponry. This is Thomas, and today we are taking a look at the Carcano M91 Moschetto, or Cavalry Carbine. It's a very interesting piece, one of the most recent ones that I picked up from my friends at the Warfront, and this one is actually just barely pre what would be considered a 9138. This one is dated 1936, so last couple of years that these were made in this exact configuration. We'll be talking about both configurations as we go into the gun room here in a minute. And the end block didn't quite fall out. Yeah, it's an interesting piece. Really short little thing, not very much recoil as it's only a 6.5mm cartridge. And let's go ahead and go into the gun room and talk a little more about this. So this is the second Carcano variation that we've taken a look at on the channel here, the first being the M38. And much like in that video, we're pretty much going to be glossing over the early history and development of the M91 design, as I would like to get an M91 long rifle and really get into that side of the history in the not too distant future. Today, we are focusing on the Moschetto. But to start off, basically you had Salvatore Carcano developed the M91 in 1891. This is a very long rifle, 30.7-inch long barrel. And that is, great for your average infantry in World War I or prior to World War I. Actually, prior to World War I, it was a very advanced design. But for, cavalry or any sort of shock troops, it was a bit overly long. So in 1893, the Moschetto was developed to remedy this situation. The barrel length was cut down to 17.7 inches, and a couple of notable things. For one, the top handguard was actually not introduced until about a year into World War I. Obviously, you could get burned pretty bad without a top handguard firing a gun rapidly. The rear sight was shortened a bit to, I believe, 1,500 meters from, I believe, 2,000 meters on the long rifle. But otherwise, it's basically the same thing. It's a lot shorter. The cleaning rod obviously had to be moved actually into the butt plate, which we'll take a look at. Half of the cleaning rod actually came with this. Only half of it, not the whole thing. Got a folding bayonet, of which there were at least 3 different variations. Even the front sight went through a couple different alterations, and the rear sight, as we will be talking about the M38 variant of the Moschetto as well. Also, they bent the bolt. The original M91s were a straight bolt. This was meant to be worn across the back. These were most prominently used by the Bersaglieri, I believe is how it is said. And these guys are very interesting. They're shock troops, light infantry, and one way to describe them would be bicycle cavalry or bicycle infantry. They were a infiltration unit, and I don't know, stuff like just little bits of history like that I find quite interesting. But with that in mind, the Moschetto is somewhat inaccurately referred to as a cavalry carbine. The reason I say this is somewhat inaccurate is the Italian military of World War I and II didn't really have much of a cavalry to speak of. They did have a cavalry, but definitely more used by groups such as the Bersaglieri. And really anybody who just needed a shorter rifle, anything shorter than, the ridiculously long original M91. As I said, otherwise, mechanically, this is going to be the same as the M91. 6-round, 6.5mm magazine. It's basically a Mannlicher design. You're using end block clips, of which you saw at the beginning of the video and will be seeing again. A lot of the details about this we're going to be taking a look at on the tabletop, because there are a multitude of just little things that were altered between just early 91 Moschettos and the 91 38s. Just little details like alterations to the rear sight, alterations to the bayonet lug, alterations to the front sight. Even the barrel shank had an alteration made. I don't know the exact year, but yeah, it's an interesting piece. They have a lot of interesting history. Prior to World War I, or going into World War I, only about 300,000 were made, or a little less than 300,000 by the end of World War I. And oddly, by the end of World War II, the Moschetto was actually the most, or made one of the most widely produced variants of the Carcano rifle. It was realized by pretty much everybody after World War I that carbines were definitely a lot more useful than long rifles for average troops. You're not going to wear them out as much, and in the trench fighting of the First World War, a lot of the long rifles were actually problematic just for negotiating your own trenches, let alone trench raids and going into your enemy's trenches and then trying to fight with this weapon that is longer than the width of the trench. Something like this would have been marvelous for that kind of a scenario. This one is a 1936 dated example, which puts it right in a time period that it could have taken place in some interesting events. The Spanish Civil War had just kicked off, and the Italians had a pretty significant investment in the Spanish Civil War. Actually, I've heard it hypothesized that if the Italians had not been so involved in the Spanish Civil War, that they would have had a much better showing in World War II, because by the time the Spanish Civil War wrapped up, World War II was kicking off. And yeah, that's really, World War II is an interesting turning point for the Moschetto cavalry carbines, as 1938, just shortly before World War II kicked off, is when these went through an overhaul and were attempted to be converted to a 7.35 millimeter cartridge, of which we talk a little more about in the M38 demo. This would have been your Moschetto M91 38. And in this variation, you'll see the rear sight remodeled, a vastly superior bayonet lock, I guess would be the correct term. Really not much else in the way of changes, but a lot of it didn't matter because in 1940 they just couldn't complete the transition because World War II had already started, so they just put everything back to 6.5. At least one company even went back to the older style of rear sight and just started making the same rifle under now the new name of 9138, where in reality it would be exactly the same as what you see before us here. So they had a lot of lives. They went through a lot of conflicts the world over. Italy was involved in a multitude of wars leading up to World War I, following World War I, and World War II, and then multiple conflicts in North Africa. You still see these popping up. They're everywhere. I don't know the exact number of Moschetto carbines that were made all total, but for Carcanos in general, it's somewhere between 2.1 and 3 million, and the Moschetto was one of the most prolific of the multiple variants of Carcano. Again, we've looked at two now, but I mean, we've still got the 91 TS, the Troupe Speciale, as well as the long rifle, as well as a really interesting one that I'm getting that is a pretty obscure one. I'm going to just drop a hint. It was made for Japan. We'll be looking at that in the not too distant future. I'm really stoked about that rifle. Very uncommon piece. But as far as the Moschetto, definitely one of the more common pieces that you can find. Definitely something that was a staple of the Italian military through both world wars, and as such, I'm very glad to have it in my collection. We're going to go ahead and go to the tabletop view here. We've got a lot of little details that we've mentioned that we're going to take a closer look at. We'll probably also bring out the M38 for a couple of comparisons, particularly for the rear sight, as it would be identical between the 9138 and the 38. So here we go. We're going to start by taking a peek at a couple of markings on here. There's not really a lot to see on the barrel shank. You've got the tourney logo here, there'll be, you know, a logo determining whichever of the multiple companies that made Carcanos made this specific rifle. Then right at the tip of my finger there, you've got a 2-digit year date followed by a Roman numeral date. The Roman numeral date corresponds to the year according to the fascist calendar. It's actually upside down, so I'm going to flip it around. See right there, 36. So this is a 1936 dated example. Also on the buttstock of these, there's often going to be a cartouche. You can only barely see it with this sling in the way. This is actually a finish marked sling, oddly enough, with this not being otherwise marked as a finish capture. I'm going to turn the rifle back around and take a look at the bayonet attachment. This is where stuff gets really interesting with the Moschetto. So there are 3 different variations of lock that I know of. The first is like a pull latch that moves back and forth like so. That was determined to be too weak around the start of World War I. They switched to this lever where you flip down like so and pull into the stock and then rotate outward. As you saw, the latch tends to move. It's a bit loose. Rotate all the way around, click it back into place, and then lock. Now, the flaw with this, as with the sliding lock actually, is when firing the rifle, this has a tendency to just slip, and then the bayonet will just go kerplunk and flop around, and that can be problematic. Now, at this point, I'm going to grab second Carcano rifle to take a look at, because the next update to the bayonet attachment actually would look a lot like it does on the M38's folding bayonet, which I had sitting aside. So completely different style of bayonet, but this button latch that you see here, where you depress the button, pull, rotate, and click, that is going to be basically the same as what you would see on the last form of this bayonet lug. The other major difference, once you see that update, the sight will be in this configuration that you see right here. Prior to that, this sight blade would actually be a little farther back on the barrel, and it would kind of be humped right here, this protruding piece. That is almost always what you're going to see on a 1936 would be this sight and the button latch. This is a weird example because it has the earlier latch, later sight combination on a 1936 dated rifle. I have seen online other people with tourney examples from 1935 and 1936 that have this configuration. I don't know why. If you look at any of the lists of how it should be, a 1936 example, or really any example post-World War I, should have the button. Even late in World War I, they just realized that this wasn't so great, as you will probably get to see demonstrated in its full glory when we go to shoot the rifle some more. Next thing we're going to be looking at is this rear sight. So this is strange. You got a 300-yard battle sight, and there's a button on this side right here. Push that in to drop this leaf, and I believe it's 450 yard zero when you get to there, and then, or meter actually, and then it graduates up clear to 1500 meters, and you just depress and click along these little notches on the side here. Generally speaking, that wasn't used an awful lot, and as such, these rifles were often converted to the M38 sight standard, and this would be what would be called the 91-38. That sight would look identical to what you see on the M38 right here. It would be a 200-meter sight. I keep on mixing up meters and yards. It's meters across the board on this. I'm sorry, we use yards here in America, so that's just is what it is. But along with the sight upgrade, they would attempt to switch this rifle over to the 735 Carcano cartridge, and would do so until about 1940, when they pretty universally went back to 6.5 Carcano as switching over a cartridge across the board for your military. It's kind of too much of an undertaking to deal with when you're in the middle of World War II. So that is where a rifle like this would have, come in with that sight, this caliber. 6.5 is, this rifle is a true M91 because it came out before 1938 when they tried to re-standardize the rifle to the 7.35 cartridge. After that, most of the companies manufacturing these, even though they'd switched back to 6.5 Carcano, would continue to use the M38 style rear sight and do away with this whole leaf tangent rear sight because it was just a mess to manufacture. And again, not a lot of people were actually using this, especially on such a short rifle. You're not making 1,500 yard shots with this thing unless you're all firing as a company into a large group of men, which isn't really how things went. Outside of that, I'm going to set aside the M38 for the time being. We no longer need it for this anyway. Bolt extraction is universal across Carcanos. You're just going to open the bolt, pull back, pull the trigger, and bolt should slide right out. You can push it back in by pulling the trigger, and it just slides right back in. And the hammer can be dropped Mauser style by pulling the trigger before you've closed the bolt and then closing the bolt. And that will safely drop the hammer without dry firing the rifle. And yeah, that's about it. Interesting piece. I actually, real quick, we had mentioned that in the buttstock, there is a compartment. So that is right here, and I'm probably going to darn near shear off my thumbnail to open this. Try again. There we go. It's stiff. Inside here is where the cleaning rod would be kept. I'll show you that real quick. Here you go, cleaning rod. As I'd mentioned, we only have half of it. There is actually a second piece. This would be the end piece, and then the first piece would attach onto that threaded end. That you just go right back in, and boom. Now, let's go back out to the range and put another magazine through this thing. Loading the Carcano is going to be the same as any other Mannlicher style feeding system, which, as we've discussed, this is a Mannlicher style rifle. We're going to actually do this segment with the bayonet folded out because I want to show you something about the locking system with this. It kind of plays into what we discussed in the tabletop segment just a moment ago. Now, bolt is a little stiff on this, I've noticed. Safety is right here. It's interesting, you depress and rotate counterclockwise to engage it, depress and rotate clockwise to turn it back off. Now, 6 shots. I've found that this hits pretty high, so we'll see if I can do a little better this go around than we did at the beginning. And there it is. This is what I was talking about. The bayonet has a tendency to flop. I can maybe tighten this lug, but there's a reason that they went away from that style of bayonet lock. Anyway, continuing. And again. I rest my case. Not a good way to lock a bayonet lug. That's all she wrote. Clip comes out the bottom. But it's a really cool piece, guys. This is something that I had intended to have in my collection for a long time and just never really acted on it because of how widely accessible they are. I just never really felt the rush. But if you're looking for something to start out a Milsurp rifle collection, these are a good place to start, honestly. They're cool. There's definitely a lot of history to them. And as of right now, this is about the cheapest military surplus rifle that you can get. Even a fairly nice example like this one with no import marks, you're going to be, generally speaking, under $500. Really, if it's over $500, you should just move along and wait for one to pop up for $300, because that's usually what they hover around. But yeah, it's a cool piece. If you're going for functionality over history, the button lug is definitely superior. This latch falls out of place, and then you have a bayonet flopping around in the wind, as you saw twice over the course of 6 shots. So anyway, hope you all enjoyed the video. It's been Thomas of Great Northwest Weaponry, and I will see you next time.